Hello and welcome to Education Scotland's The Pedagogy Podcast. I'm your host, Bex Ewart, and I will be leading us through some really interesting conversations around about pedagogy with a really wide and broad spectrum of educational professionals, children and young people. This podcast came about as a response to the OECD report, which found that in order to improve the quality of outcomes for our children, practitioners and teachers need to be supported to explore their own pedagogy and their practice through a pedagogical lens. Hi everybody and welcome to this episode of Education Scotland's The Pedagogy Podcast, and I'm here with Dr Marion Burns, who I'm really excited to talk with. So hi Marion, nice to see you again.
Good morning, Bex.
And so let's kick off. So Marion, can you give us a little bit of the background about you and how you find yourself where you are today?
Well, I think my career is long and varied, and so finding myself where I am at the moment, which is sort of retired and sort of not, kind of redefining that word actually, just to kind of rewind the tape a little bit and thinking about my career, although I spent a lot of time in early years and still do. I started off as a class teacher in primary school. From there, I was a senior teacher, which of course is a post that doesn't exist anymore. It has come and gone, but it was a really useful post because at the time it gave you the opportunity to develop yourself whilst still having that contact with children in the classroom. That kind of took me on to being the head teacher of 3 different primary schools, mostly in areas of significant deprivation. That, for me, was certainly an eye-opener because of 2 of the 3 were really, in terms of that socioeconomic, the demographics, they seemed as if they were the same, but actually it was about the culture, which was totally different. And so that really was that watershed moment for me in thinking about children and families who suffer, and as a result of that, it's how they then kind of move on in life and how they value education. But the third post was quite the opposite. As a head, it was in an area where there was a lot more wealth, if you like, but it was still a very rewarding post. Then that took me probably on into being an AA with Education Scotland, which at the time wasn't Education Scotland, it was HMIe. And so pretty much kind of 20 years, I would say, of my life was spent in doing that post. That moment in the journey for me also highlighted that I did have a really strong affinity, if you like, with the early childhood sector. I decided to do a bit of further study, and so I did a master's with Strathclyde, having started in Strathclyde, though in those days it was Jordan Hill College of Education. Yeah, it was at that point had joined Strathclyde, so I did a master's which looked our focus was on transitions, but it was pastoral transitions, so that linked, if you like, to my experience as a head teacher and how important it is to really work with community and think about the whole culture around the school and the setting. Because of the schools that I was ahead, I did have nursery class as well. Those in the old enough listening to this will remember the voucher years, which were painful. It was really important to me to think about just what it was like for children making that move, that transition out of one sector on into another that maybe didn't have the continuum of having a nursery class in a school. That was interesting, and it was one of those things that you just managed along with the day job and the family and so on. And I thought, right, I'm never going to study ever again. That's it. I'm not doing this. Anyway, some years later I did. And that's when I did my doctorate at Strathclyde again. And as you can imagine, that kind of in with the bricks now with Strathclyde, do a wee bit of work for them as well from time to time. So that's the doctorate there was looking at early childhood. But again, the link there was transitions, and particularly the early level, because the day job was throwing up for me that those transitions for children across the early level were not continuous in terms of good continuity, and the children's experience wasn't the way the early level was intended, that there would be that real balance in terms of pedagogy. So they were finding themselves leaving a very child-centred, reflexive situation and space to move on into a primary school where it wasn't always conducive to the way that children learn, which is through play. So yeah, so that interest, I think, has just continued. And so the work that I do with some authorities now is looking at play, but looking at leadership of play and leadership of pedagogy. So that's kind of me, but there's some probably influential people along the way, which I think we'll maybe kind of come on to it at some point. I think, finishing the doctorate only happened because I moved from being a full-time HMI to a part-time HMI. It just couldn't be done. I just found I was never going to get there. So I took some time out, if you like, but I'll probably come on and say a bit more about that. That also, yes, indeed. And also the privilege of being able to work on realising the ambition with Lynn Taylor and Liz Patterson, because being going part-time, and then the opportunity arose because of the Blueprint 2020 Action Plan number 9. Then that was a job that had to be done. And so it was.
Great. And that's how we first crossed paths, was a long time ago when we were talking through that. So it's interesting that you started in the primary sector but found your home in the early years. So, and you've talked a little bit about the kind of different pedagogies that you see across the two sectors. What does the term pedagogy mean to you?
It's the way it's described in Realising the Ambition. It talks about understanding and knowing how children learn and develop, and they make it happen, whoever the they happen to be. I think that we need to move away from the terminology of practitioner and teacher if we're thinking about that continuum, if we're thinking about pedagogy, and move more into educator, because that also brings in the role of the parent, the role of other adults, and so it links also to me. It links to leadership as well. So pedagogical leadership, which is spoken about and written about in Realising the Ambition. When I was doing a bit of research, clearly for content with Realising the Ambition, then I was looking at researchers and writers, and Siraj Blatchford, she says it's the instructional techniques and strategies which enable learning to take place. And it's interactive. I think pedagogy, particularly in early childhood, is very relational, it's very interactive, but it's also responsive as well. And it's that interaction, as we say in Realising the Ambition, interactions, experiences and spaces. And so the pedagogy really should be reflecting a very child-oriented, child-centred way of thinking. And so it's relational and it's responsive. And I think it's not the same as teaching. For me, there's a real distinction between pedagogy and learning and teaching. The important thing is that people know when they are engaged in pedagogical practice, as opposed to being teacher-led or teaching an activity. I have difficulty with the word activity. For me, it sounds very adult, determined, whereas an experience is born out of the climate and the culture in which the child lives, inhabits, and so therefore the adults around the child behave and act in a different way if they are pedagogical leaders than if they are teachers. And that actually, unless we understand that and have a shared vision, a view of pedagogy, then we're going to have real issues around trying to implement play pedagogy if we still wear a hat where we see ourselves as imparting knowledge and giving knowledge away.
Yeah. I think the distinction that you draw there between the use of language, particularly around teaching and learning and pedagogy, is something that I'm thinking a lot about in terms of how we support that moving forwards in being the facilitator for children to lead their own learning. But it requires quite a big shift in how you understand yourself as the professional in the room, regardless of whether you're a practitioner or a teacher or a senior leader. So what's supported you to move through that thinking, and to what kind of questions do you need to ask yourself to start to be secure in understanding your role?
There are a number of things that, if you like, have helped to shape my view around what do we mean by pedagogy. And I draw on a story from an HMIe visit to a very rural setting on an island in Scotland. And it was a playroom where there was a wee fellow called Ocean, and he had scissors and sellotape and newsprint paper, and he was making himself a waistcoat. He was so engrossed in that, and you really needed to know the child's why. Why was he doing what he was doing? And unfortunately, the educator, the adults in the room, clearly didn't have the capacity to understand this was not the moment to bombard the child with several questions about what he was doing and why he was doing it. It was that stepping back and knowing when is the moment to support or to guide. And I'm minded here by Bernstein's thinking about invisible pedagogy, where there is strong framing, which is what was about to happen till I almost rugby tackled this educator to leave Ocean alone. Was clearly they wanted to get in there and interfere and say, well, do it this way. Then Bernstein would say that was weak framing. So it was very much about the child, and we were taking the lead from the child. And that is fine to step back and just watch, because when you notice what the child is doing, it informs you about where you're going to go next. And as I say, I really had to step in from the point of view of, distracting the educator to say, leave him alone, let him create his waistcoat. And actually the end product was fantastic.
So I can see there's very clear rationale and a very clear way of moving that forwards in the early years, partly because of the demands of the curriculum, I suppose, and the demands that are set in terms of achievement of a level at the end of primary one. In your view, is that where that pedagogy sits, or do we need to start thinking about how that looks further up the school, and in which case how can we balance the accountability agenda alongside the following the interests of the children in front of us?
What I would draw on there is Christine Stevens' work, and Christine conducted a study a number of years ago, and it was having conversations with early stages teachers, and when they talked about pedagogy and their craft, they talked about the stuff, they talked about the activities that they'd planned. They didn't talk about, they were unable to articulate the skills and the attributes and the experiences that the children were gaining. So if we really haven't got that continuum, and that's all about that progression across the early level, if we don't have that from ELC on into primary and beyond, with the educators who are there, then what we'll have is a mismatch between the child's experience in a pedagogic culture, and Lorna Arnott talks about pedagogic culture and how children can negotiate and subvert the culture and the way in which they behave. But as that child moves on into the early stages of primary school, then they're limited in the extent to which they can subvert the culture, because the systems and the routines are such that there are boundaries that are just followed. And that is about that achieving the level. It is about meeting targets. But if we look at our, European neighbours, then children still make progress, they still move in terms of their learning journey. It's not about readying them for something else. So I think there's a load of work to be done in and around initial teacher education and working across, that collaboration that is one of the 5 C's within transitions and realising the ambition. But it's also about that finding a meeting place in the middle, and Peter worked around, that finding the middle space, which we've not yet achieved, I don't think. And if we're only looking to get children to a point at the end of P1 or P2, then it's almost like, well, our pedagogical thinking is wrong. We need to unravel that.
I agree. And I think it goes back to that understanding about the role of the adult in the space and what a good teacher is. And so, yeah, absolutely. I think you're talking about ITE there is really important, but also supporting those conversations in established teams who are maybe not initial teacher, but have been steeped in a particular type of pedagogy for most of their career. I think one of the tensions for me around Curriculum for Excellence is that we have a policy landscape which asks us to think about education in the way that you're describing and asks us to create and negotiate and follow children's leads. But I don't think we had the conversation that went alongside that around about what that means as teaching professionals or as leaders within settings.
Yeah, and as I said, as I kind of alluding to Peter Moss's work there about reconceptualising, early childhood, then if we have, for me, 2 distinct groups of educators, early years professionals have a totally different initial training, professional experience to the rigid structures that I think exist within primary schools, and so the training that happens is shifted. I mean, from my days way back in Strathclyde and Jordan Hill, then we had a big block of time in an ELC setting, and that is now reduced to something, it's minimal. I mean, I don't know the exact hours and whatever, but it's minimal, and it's almost lip service. So there's a thing too, I think, around policy, which is important, that from the ground up, there's that co-construction of policy and systems. Realising the ambition is a co-constructed document. In the early stages of it, we took sections out and said, well, what do you think? How does this mean something to you? Can it influence your practice and what you do? And so it certainly, the political landscape is such that if we're going to refresh, and it has been, it's a few years ago now since we've sort of refreshed narrative of Curriculum for Excellence, that maybe we need to flip that on its head and focus more on the 4 capacities. And rather than the early level 144 experiences and outcomes that we feel we've got to do and achieve by a line in the sand. But I understand the pressures that educators find themselves in schools, because there's that parental pressure in some areas. There's, that leadership, which is, it's not authoritarian, but it's a type of leadership style that it doesn't have the same feel about it. Rory McDowell-Clark and Murray, they talk about diffused leadership as opposed to distributed leadership. And so, we can delegate things, but if you've got diffused leadership, it's like everybody has a role and a responsibility to take whatever it is forward. And if it's that pedagogical approach, which you would hope people are passionate about, but how do you instill that passion if you're not coming from a child-centred view, that you're not embracing the children you have in front of you? You only see them as a group of 20-something that you need to move on to the next stage because the school's got targets. And unless we do have that meeting in the middle, unless we do have that collaboration, we're always going to be bumping up against two different cultures, which, you know, when I was doing my doctoral study, what I discovered with the early level was that the children entered two different spaces, contested spaces and unified spaces at points in their, you know, that transition journey.
Mm-hmm.
The contested space was where things were very different in terms of the pedagogical approaches. So they'd moved from something that was child-centred, child-led, on into an ethos and a culture where the structure of the day took over. And over time, the children move into that because the compliance is such that, you know, we ease into the rules that we live by. But for the child moving into a unified space, and I suppose there are parallels between that weak framing and, you know, the kind of strong framing. Mm-hmm. But in a unified space, the child knows, feels things are sort of the same, not completely, but there's familiarity in the space, familiarity in the pedagogical approaches, familiarity in having a voice. Mm-hmm. Whereas in a contested space, the child lacks agency and voice.
Yes. Sorry, I'm the pause there is I'm thinking about my own experience of different spaces and walking into them and thinking, again, because this particular conversation is not just for early years educators and those in the early stages of primary, but to consider how this might inform pedagogies across the age ranges. And the description there of the contested space actually seems quite like the systems that are in place in somewhere like a secondary school, for example, where it is very much about a contested space. It's very much about systems driving pedagogy. Is that a fair statement, or have
yes,
I mischaracterized it?
Yeah, no, I think it is a fair statement. And again, I would link, you know, that transitions experience of our children crossing the early level, you know, those boundaries. And because you know, Sally Peters talks about children who are, you know, who cross boundaries and they experience them. The same is true of P7 on into S1. So children find themselves, you know, in a space, a contested space that where they had a huge amount of autonomy, probably as a P7, and the different things that happen in an effective and successful upper primary school stage. Mm-hmm. But then they move on to secondary school, where, you know, again, bells ring more often even than in a primary school. And you've got your subject specialisms and so on. And my granddaughter, who's just about to leave sixth year in a secondary school, I won't name what it is, but you know, her experience for me, I would say there were times when there's definitely been a contested space, because depending on who the teacher was, mm-hmm. would very much depend on how much she liked the subject, how much she responded to what was being asked of her. So it's that consistency of pedagogical approaches. And clearly, if you are you know, a teacher of home economics, then the pedagogy that's used there will be different to if you're in an English language class. But for me, the underlying principle in terms of pedagogy is knowing and understanding how young people learn and mm-hmm. make it happen. So that, you know, that RTA mantra about listening with your eyes and your ears, if you really know young people, whether they're 3 or 13 or about to leave at 18, you need to know children, you need to know young people and what makes them tick.
Yes. So one of the things that you said earlier that I'd like to kind of revisit is around about the supporting of play pedagogy in terms of the leadership aspect. Mm-hmm. So can you say a little bit more about that and the kind of approaches that you've been using to support leaders across schools?
I've been working with, you know, a couple of authorities. Most, I think, I would speak about the amount and the volume and the kind of intensity, if you like, of work that I've been doing has been with Glasgow City Council, which mm-hmm. has been, you know, sort of 2 years. And It's a bespoke leadership program, which, if you look to the shelf of leadership programs, you kind of cast your eye along the spine of the, folders. It'll say primary, it'll say secondary, but we've got nothing, very little, that is bespoke to early learning and childcare, to early childhood. So this was a fantastic opportunity to be able to work alongside ELC leaders in a large authority, over 100 settings, plus partners, another 100 and something. So to come up with something that suited their needs, because again, that co-construction, what is it that would help you as a leader in ELC when you've got 1140 and the expansion, and the kind of 4 pillars of that: the accessibility, affordability, the quality, and I've forgotten the 4th one for the moment because
Flexibility.
Thank you. Flexibility. That's the one, of course, that's causing, a fair amount of problem.
Yeah.
Because somebody's flexibility doesn't fit in, shoehorned into the, what's available. So yeah, and to work alongside ELC heads and to support them, and to say, as a pedagogical leader, you have got such a lot to offer and to bring. Far too often, the language and the rhetoric around ELC is about, we're going down to ELC, and, the language of, well, but you're not a teacher, you are, but it's a degree-led profession. So many now have, gone to BACP, they've got masters, they are following Fribble, and so there's a huge appetite to really get it right, to make sure that children, our very youngest children, our most precious gifts, actually get the, that best, that kind of trotting out the kind of Scottish Government words. But for me, it's about taking the child from where they're at, but getting leaders to believe that what they do is valued across the country, which sadly hasn't politically, again, been the case. So that leadership programme has now involved rather a large number, probably nearer 100 of ELC heads, and then pretty much the same around deputies, lead practitioners, and the graduates, but working also with partnership nurseries as well, and looking and using, if you like, realising the ambition as the core, and taking each of those sections and talking about play, talking about pedagogy, talking about quality, talking about transitions, and then section 3 about how children grow and develop. So it's been a really super and very worthwhile opportunity for me to be able to take some of my beliefs about pedagogy and about leadership, and I suppose instill a belief. And Lewin Bennett talks about your practice, and what you believe is so important, and it's belief that drives your practice.
Yes, that makes an awful lot of sense there. And I think the two things that jump out to me when you were speaking were, alongside that view of leadership as in really having a deep knowledge of child development, which of course, as we know now, children's and young people's brains are not fully developed until they're in their mid-20s. So that continuum of development actually could be a really powerful influence in terms of getting things right for our young people, but also the understanding of play. And I think that term is often very poorly misunderstood, but with a real certainty that the people using the term know what they're saying. So there's that kind of children learn through play. Well, they can't possibly, because they don't know what they don't know, and they're just keeping themselves busy.
Yes. I've got a paper that I refer to from time to time, and it is the Playing Learning Child. And as I say, that for me is a paper that's really important. And it's Ingrid Pramlin Samuelson and Madge Abslung Carlson, who in this paper, what they do is they talk about the child as they don't see play and learning separated.
Yeah.
They for them it's very much about the two come together. By playing, they're learning.
Yes.
And you can get into discussions about but learning can take place without there being play. And that's one I think we could kind of debate for the rest of this, conversation.
Yeah.
That we all play. We play with our phones when we get a new one. We play with the controls of our car, and we come to understand what they do, or if it's the television or your iPad. So through that play, and there is learning. Children don't separate them. It's not like, well, you can play now and then you're going to learn after playtime, or this afternoon when you're outside, there might be some playing, but then you're going to come back in and you're going to learn. That's really not how children develop.
Yep. One of the things that I read recently was I'm just trying to pull it up just now, which is why looked like I was fiddling. It's called Play to Thrive, The Key to Recovery and a Flourishing Future, with Fullan, Rincon Gallardo and Clinton. And there's a definition of play in here that I really enjoy, which is something around about play. Think of play not as a product, but as a process that contains certain characteristics like intrinsic motivation, choice, exploration, challenge. I'd like to get the proper wording, but I don't want to be rude. But I think that's the thing, isn't it? If you marry your understanding of play as a more kind of nebulous concept about the attitudinal approach to being human in a space, and then with that the child development, then you can see that play needs to look different in the early years, because our children are concrete in their development. So instead of turning ideas upside down, they have to turn physical objects around and see what happens when they combine them and really experience it with their bodies. But as you move forward in terms of your ability to be more abstract in your thinking, you can begin to play much more with ideas, and the play develops that way.
Yeah, and there's always purpose attached to a child's play. It's their purpose as opposed to an external purpose. And when we say purposeful play, when the adult says the child is going to engage in purposeful play, then we take away that intrinsic motivation. So the child is really interested in something, and they are playing with whatever it is. I after the International Play Association conference last June, I, along with any others, wrote a little piece called "The Boy, the Worm and the Leaf." And it's in the inspirationally playful little pamphlet that John McKendrick pulled together following the conference. And this was actually based on an observation as I was dropping my grandson off to school one morning. And just at the school gates, this wee fellow got sight of this worm. And you can imagine the school gates is pretty busy with people coming in and out and all the rest of it. He was playing in his own way with the worm, but the purpose of his play was to save the worm. And I watched him for easily 5 minutes, and he eventually managed to get the worm safely onto a leaf. He found a leaf, and he coaxed the worm onto the leaf, and eventually he carried the leaf with the worm and put it in a safe place. Now, there was all sorts of stuff going on right about him, but nobody picked up on that. And I'm just thinking, in terms of pedagogy, that responsive pedagogy of an interest in a mini beast or in this wee fellow's worm, an adult would have picked up and been responsive and thinking, well, how can I take that forward? Or was it just a moment in time? And only when he was happy that he had secured the safety of the worm did he skip off and on into school. And the piece that I wrote was all about the boy, the worm, and the leaf.
It is that intense noticing and
Yes.
that confidence to be able to interpret what you see, I suppose, and make the judgment about what the best way forwards is.
Yeah.
We do so much of our job through habit, I suppose. It's re-establishing habits that we choose rather than habits that are I-been.
Yes, and the systems are such that we comply with them, and that's when I talk about the child moving out of that contested space through time on into the unified space. The space that felt contested over time becomes the norm, and the child adjusts and becomes familiar with the new space, the new routine. And so there is that, and for every child, that period of time will be unique to them, about how long it takes them to feel that they are comfortable in that space. And it's down to the adult, the educator in the room, to pick up on what it is that will help that child make the move smoothly, comfortably into a space that feels good, and they feel safe and able to have a voice.
Okay, so we've explored the term pedagogy and what that looks like in various different contexts. And you've mentioned a few thinkers that have informed your own personal understanding of pedagogy. Is there anybody that we haven't covered that you think is actually it would be really useful to explore?
Well, I mean, I think about Barbara Rogoff's work, who she talks about guided participation. And clearly what she has done is she has built on Vygotsky's scaffolding. And if we think about, approaching the child as she talks about it being apprentices in learning, then it's through that guided participation that the adult has a role to play. And I like the word guided, because it suggests to me that you are working alongside the child in a way that isn't having a huge influence other than when it's needed. And so I find her work interesting. I've also more recently, if you like, been reading Santiago Rincon Gallardo's work, and he talks about learning to liberate. I changed the title of his book a little bit recently and called it Leading to Liberate, a social movement, so I hope he doesn't mind. But and if we think of children as being leaders, if we think about educators about being leaders, and what I particularly like about his take on learning and leadership is that where there's policy, and we touched on that earlier about the kind of constraints, if you like, of the systems and the routines that exist in and around policy, and that we should be able to take policy and have some influence over the content of it. But where you can't, what Santiago suggests is that you leverage the policy in a way that helps you. So if we take that, the transitions policies, then we see that as a process over time, and it's more about, well, the child has to move from ELC to primary. The young person has to move at various points in the day, vertical and horizontal transitions. But how can we make it work for the child so that that's the focus? And that's what I like about his work. I suppose other thinkers, probably, working with Lynn Taylor and her take on play, thinking also working alongside James McTaggart and his, the 6 dimensions. And there was discussion there about what, are there 5 or are there 6? And James insists there are 6 dimensions in realising the ambition. And so they have influenced, if you like, deepened, broadened my thinking around how children learn. I was very fortunate to spend a month in Australia and then New Zealand as part of the Pedagogies of Educational Transitions programme in 2016, which is, a few years ago now. But having the exposure to those different cultures and the way that early childhood is viewed, that actually had an influence, if you like, in my thinking, but also influenced some of the content of realising the ambition, because that woven mat, the Tufariki mat, has influenced that thinking about, the tartan and the weaving and the weft of the threads, the golden threads of life and of our children and young people just through childhood.
Yeah.
So there are similarities, if you like, in that philosophy, that holistic thinking about early childhood that I've taken from those experiences of being elsewhere. I love Salberg and Doyle's Let the Winds Play, Let the Children Play. And how we take over children's lives, that they've got piano, they've got horse riding, they've got football, and they don't have a minute to be themselves, because the adult is not guiding, is influencing almost their every waking moment.
Yeah. There's a lot that that chimes with me when you're talking there. The bit that I feel quite excited about from Rincon Gallardo's work is his talk about the pedagogical unit as the key lever of change. And when you think about that, the pedagogical unit is the adult, the child, and the setting. And actually, we have an enormous amount of influence over that. And so we can, as a profession, as educators, with that shared understanding, we've got the levers we need to start to shift things to move in the direction that we would like.
We need to make sure, though, that in terms of power, I mean, we often talk about, we empower people, we empower children, but there are limitations, which means that we are not absolutely authentic when we talk about empowering and giving power, because we still hold on to an element of power. I know you're talking there about the environment, about the spaces that children occupy. The adult has a huge influence on what that looks like, what it feels like to be in that space. And, if you leave children to decide what's going in the space, it will inevitably look different to what maybe the adult had in mind.
Yeah.
I mean, I recall when I was gathering the data for my, doctoral thesis, them going into this space, and it was just after the school summer holidays, and the children had been in the space, and then they came back the next day and there was a beach. And, there was sand, there was buckets, there was some shells. And they thought, well, that wasn't there yesterday. Well, where's my ownership? Where's the power of my voice and being able to influence what that actually looks like? So, if we think of the environment as the totality of the curriculum, as the totality of the child's experience, they have to have a voice in that. Yeah. And I love Alison Clark's work that helps us think about giving voice to children, but it's authentic voice as opposed to lip service.
Which goes back to that aspect of pedagogy as a relational and responsive thing, which involves that human meeting, which traditionally is something that we've not been supported through, I don't think, to explore fully. The other thing that was coming up in my mind while you were talking there about that was I recently spoke with Andreas Schleicher as part of this series, and one of the things that he talked about was that schools are the institutions of the 20th century, and the early years approaches are the institutions of the 21st and moving forwards, and that it's that shift. And if we gave over the power to the teaching and the education professionals, he was saying, I bet the systems would look really quite different, because he talked a lot about that apprenticeship model, about how the current systems divorce learning and feedback. And the apprentice model, you get continuous feedback throughout things that are going through. So yeah, it's interesting how everyone's thinking the same things. They're all tying together.
Yeah. One of the things that I, in the leadership program that I do with ELC heads is to think about leadership and, that paradigm shift, that we need to think differently about who we are as leaders and how we can influence, how we can leverage policy, how we can make things work for us, whilst staying within the legislative expectation and requirements that are there from external visitors coming along to see what's happening. And but I think if we really did believe that if the educator has a voice, and children are educators.
Mm-hmm.
They educate each other. They by being alongside each other, that supportive other that's alongside, and that watching, and well, I couldn't balance on the beam this morning, but I can now because my friend held my hand.
Yep.
And so it's important to get Michael Fullan talks about the right drivers and the wrong drivers.
Yeah.
If like Andreas Schleicher, if we were liberating, and mostly Michael Fullan and Santiago work together, so we've got like minds. I mean, and another kind of, and sort of just briefly to mention, is the Mitchell Resnick and the lifelong kindergarten, and that thinking of thinking about creativity. And if we allow children to be creative, truly creative, as Ocean tried to be with his waistcoat, as other children I've seen, in other situations, then I do think we would have a much more effective, impactful experience for children if we just gave over some of that power to them rather than holding on to it.
Yes. So from the conversation that we've had over the last 45 minutes or so, what's the key message that you'd like educators to take to inform their own pedagogical practice?
Well, I've been thinking about that because I knew you were going to ask me. I can't think about pedagogy without also thinking about place. Another experience that I invite leaders to engage in is to think about a place that is meaningful to them, and what is it about that place that holds such a lot of emotion, a lot of memory, a lot of sometimes baggage, and to talk about that place. And so if we think about pedagogy as knowing how you learn, in other words, if the place for you that's important is the beach, or it's climbing a tree, but it goes way back to your own childhood, it brings such a strength of feeling, and it can be in around smell and taste, so all the senses are heightened. And if we can create places for children, spaces for children and young people where they can actually see and feel and hear the pedagogy. And so I would call that a pedagogy of passion for children. And those educators really need to know their why, but they also need to know the child's why. And what is your vision? Is it a shared vision, or is it just something you're doing because it's in a policy somewhere?
Yep. Get in touch with your own why. I think that if you're there, then I think you find your joy as well. I wonder whether a lot of the kind of feeling of overwhelm at the moment is because we've lost, we're not starting from our why, and we've lost our spark a bit.
Yep. And again, sort of, I used to be quote from Elmer, which is about making sense of things that matter. So if that place matters to you, of that experience with the children matters to you, then that the pedagogy will be passionate.
Yeah.
And who stands to gain? I would suggest everybody does.
I would agree there.
Yep. And the passion rubs off on others. Where you've got a passionate staff, a passionate team, a passionate group of people, and thinking about those communities of practice where we all have a kind of like mind and a moving together collaboratively with that goal in mind, which is that children matter.
Absolutely. Okay, so what's next for you then, Marion? What's on the horizon?
Well, probably eventually to work my way to that retirement word, but there's still some stuff in the pipeline. I'm going to be involved with a university in Gießen in Germany, and some colleagues from Strathclyde, which is looking at play in the early stages of primary. And according to our colleagues in Guyson, there's not enough play in primary. So we're going to have that exchange, which is in June. I'm going with Ali Mendy-Dunlop to Guyson, to the university there. And Justice Ligberg, I think is the name of the university. And so we will go and we will be part of that experience. And then the people that we will meet with will come back at the end of August. And so we will be working on, I presume, some sort of findings that we might share. I'm currently working on a piece for Sue Dockett and Bob Perry, a chapter in their book, and the Bloomsbury Book of Transitions is hopefully coming out for publication later this year. So yeah.
So you've just been twiddling your thumbs, really, Marion.
I really have, yeah. It's it, yes. So yeah, and to continue to fight the fight for you know, an early childhood workforce, or you know, group of educators that are valued across the country, because I'm the chair of the board of Early Years Scotland, and that's such valuable work, working with Jane and her staff team and the you know, the staff there. That's been great, and we've got a great board who really are very much the advocates for early childhood. So just a few things to kind of
just a few things to keep you occupied. Just a few experiences. So the thing that seems to be the biggest spanner in the works for folk who come and chat on this podcast are the 2 spaces on the playlist for your inspirational tunes.
Yes.
So what have you chosen, and is there a reason behind your choice?
Harry Chapin's Flowers Are Red.
Okay.
And the reason for that is that the wee fellow who on his first day of school gets some crayons and he starts to draw. You'll know the song. And there's that creativity for this child who's starting school, and the teacher intervenes and says, well, you know, flowers are different. They've got to be a particular colour. So you're stifling that creativity. And for me, the song speaks of compliance and conformity. And I think there are examples of that still exist in playrooms and classrooms. You know, when you look at the walls of displays, you know, and there are 21 snowmen that look the same, or, you know, daffodils that, you know, are all pointing in the same direction. So for me, the words, it almost makes me tearful, because there's a verse in it that says, the teacher put him in a corner. She said, it's for your own good, and you won't come out till you get it right. And are you responding like you should? It's almost, you know, it kind of makes me tearful to think about not, you know, allowing children to have purpose and passion about their play and about their art and their creativity. So what it does is it pushes me to challenge beliefs about pedagogical approaches.
Absolutely.
So that's one. And the other one is Run Rig. Tear down these walls. So again, I liken this to the kind of constraints of policy and systems, and the words in Tear Down These Walls speaks of resistance to the big guns and that policy imposition. So there's kind of metaphorical walls, barriers, and they get in the way of social movement, and I think education is a social movement. I didn't mention Bronfenbrenner earlier, but he's another influence in my thinking about, you know, those concentric rings and about the child being at the centre. And so I do fret about the challenges that we also have to democracy. You know, you've got to look around you and look beyond our own shores, and that's a worry. But I also have read Michelle van den Broek, Joanne Lair, and Linda Mitchell's work on the decommodification of early childhood, and not seeing the child as a commodity for the future, rather than looking at them and seeing them as who they are at this point, about being me.
Absolutely. Being me. Yes. Thank you so much for your time. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you, Marion. I really appreciate it.
You're very welcome.